He stood at the podium of the Frankfurt Book Fair and read a passage from his debut novel. The crowd applauded. I was sitting 3 rows back holding a manila folder on my lap, and I already knew every single word he was about to say, because I had written them first. Let me take you back to the beginning. Because this story does not start with rage, it starts with hope, which is somehow worse. It was a Tuesday in late October, about 18 months before that book fair reading. I remember the exact quality of the light in the editorial office on the 4th floor of Brennwald Verlag, that particular pale northern German light that comes through frosted glass and makes everything look slightly underwater. I had just arrived for my second official meeting with my editor, a man named Konrad Veit. I was 26. It was my first novel. I had spent 4 years writing it, 2 years revising it, and approximately 1,000 cups of bad coffee getting it to the point where I believed in it enough to submit it. The manuscript was called Die Stille zwischen den Worten, The Silence Between Words, and it was a novel about a woman who survives a fire and has to reconstruct her life, her memory, and her identity through fragments of other people's accounts of her. It was personal, it was precise, it was mine. Konrad Veit was 53 years old, silver-haired in the way that men in publishing are silver-haired, which is to say deliberately. He wore linen jackets in autumn, which should have told me something. He had edited 3 prize-winning novels in the previous decade and was considered one of the best literary editors in the German-speaking world. He had chosen my manuscript personally from the slush pile. He had called me himself. He had said, and I remember this exactly because I wrote it down in my notebook the same evening, "Your voice is unlike anything I've read in years. This book is going to matter." I believed him. Of course I believed him. The second meeting was supposed to be about the editorial roadmap. When I arrived, his assistant, Petra, let me in with a slightly too careful smile, the kind of smile that is doing extra work. Konrad was on the phone. He waved me toward the chair across from his desk. I sat down. On his desk, next to a cold cup of coffee and a stack of manuscripts, was a printed copy of the first 100 pages of my book. It had red marks on it, a lot of red marks. Not the usual editorial kind, the careful suggestions and structural notes I had seen in his emails. These were something else, big sweeping crosses through whole paragraphs, question marks over character names, and in the margin of page 14, where I had written a scene about my protagonist finding her mother's handwriting on a grocery list, someone had written, "Use this," different context. I looked at that note for a long time. Konrad finished his phone call, turned around, and gave me the smile. The one I would come to recognize over the next several months. Not warm, not cold, calibrated. "Clara," he said. "My name is Clara Wendt. I've been thinking a lot about your manuscript. It's remarkable, genuinely, but I think we need to slow down." "Slow down," I repeated. "The market is complicated right now. Literary debut fiction is a hard sell. I want to make sure we position this perfectly. There's no point rushing." I asked about the timeline we had discussed. He had originally mentioned spring publication. He now said autumn of the following year was more realistic. That was a delay of 18 months. I asked about the red marks on my manuscript. He glanced at the pages, then back at me, and something moved behind his eyes. "Just thinking out loud," he said. "Brainstorming. Don't worry about those." I did not argue. I smiled. I said that sounded fine. I asked if I could take those marked pages with me to review his notes at home. He said he preferred to keep them for now. I said of course. I went home. I made tea, I opened my laptop, and I started keeping a document. Not a diary. A record. Dates, times, exact words spoken, exact words written. I had learned from my mother, who was a nurse for 30 years, that the most important thing you can do when something feels wrong is to write it down before you convince yourself it was nothing. Something felt wrong. Over the next 3 months, I sent Konrad 5 revised chapters. He responded to 2 of them. His responses were brief, vague, and always ended with some version of, "This is coming together beautifully, let's not rush." The publication timeline moved again. Now it was early the following year. Then we'll revisit in the spring. Then the catalog is full, but you're definitely on my priority list. I started asking questions. Carefully, politely, specifically. I asked about the contract clause regarding publication windows. I asked about the marketing budget. I asked about the cover design process, which was supposed to have started already. Each question was met with warmth and deflection. Konrad was very good at warmth and deflection. He had the voice of a man who had been trusted for decades and knew exactly how to use that. In February, I had lunch with a woman named Sanne Broder. Sanne was a literary agent who had been working in Frankfurt for 20 years. She was not my agent. I had no agent, which was one of my mistakes. Sanne was a friend of a friend, and we met for lunch because I needed to talk to someone who knew this world and would be honest with me. I told her what was happening. I told her about the delays, the vague responses, the marked up pages. I did not yet tell her about the note in the margin. I was still not sure what to do with that. Sanne put down her fork. She looked at me for a moment in a way that made my stomach tighten. "Has Konrad mentioned anything about his own writing?" she asked. I said no. I knew he had published some essays years ago, but nothing recently. Sanne said, "He's been working on a novel. He's been talking about it quietly for about 2 years. A literary novel about memory and identity. He's apparently very protective of it." I looked at her. She looked at me. Neither of us said the thing we were both thinking. But I went home and I opened my laptop and I started doing something I should have done months earlier. I went through every version of my manuscript. I had been saving dated drafts since the very beginning, the habit of a paranoid writer, and a very good decision in retrospect. I had the original submission file from 2 years ago. I had every revision. I had the metadata embedded in the documents, which included creation dates, modification dates, and in several cases, the exact time I had written specific passages. I also had every email I had ever sent to or received from Conrad Veidt and from Brenwald Verlag's editorial department. I printed everything, I put it in a manila folder. Then I put that folder inside a larger folder. Then I put that inside a box, which I labeled Tax Documents 2022, and stored on the shelf above my desk. I am not a dramatic person by nature. I am a person who writes about silence and fragments and the things that survive a fire. I know how to wait. In March, I found out about the book. It was not a dramatic discovery. There was no single smoking gun moment. It was a series of small things that accumulated until they became undeniable. First, a listing in the Brenwald Verlag Spring Catalog for a forthcoming novel by Conrad Veidt titled Was vom Feuer bleibt? What Remains of the Fire? I saw it on the publisher's website while I was checking for news about my own publication status. I sat with that title for a long time. Then I found an interview Conrad had given to a small literary magazine in January. He described his novel as being about a woman who must reconstruct herself through the accounts of others after a traumatic event. He said the central metaphor was the way identity is not stored in ourselves, but in the people around us, in their words, in their memories of us. I put my hand flat on my desk. I breathed. Then I went to my shelf and I took down the box labeled Tax Documents 2022. I spent 2 weeks going through everything. I cross-referenced the specific language in Conrad's interview with specific passages in my manuscript. I found 8 direct conceptual parallels. Not plagiarism in the crude copy-paste sense. Subtler than that, the architecture of the idea, the specific emotional logic, the central image of the grocery list with the mother's handwriting appeared in his book description as a fragment of a dead woman's daily life that becomes the key to recovering a lost identity. That was the note in the margin of page 14. Use this. Different context. I also found something else in the emails. In November, Conrad had forwarded one of my revised chapters to an address I did not recognize, with a subject line that said, reference material, see section 3. The forwarded email had no additional text, just my chapter, sent to someone I had never heard of. I looked up that email address. It belonged to a freelance manuscript consultant named Tobias Frank, who listed Conrad Veidt as a client on his professional website. I added that to the folder. In April, I requested a meeting with Conrad. I told him I wanted to discuss the publication timeline and some questions about the contract. He responded warmly. He said he was glad I was being proactive. We met in the same office with the same frosted glass light. He told me, with genuine gentleness, that the publication of my novel would need to be pushed back further. He was now suggesting the following autumn, which would be 2 full years after the original spring date. He said the market was difficult. He said debut literary fiction required careful positioning. He said something that I have thought about many times since. He said, young voices need to learn to wait, Clara. The patience is part of the craft. The best writers understand that. I looked at him. I kept my face very still. Of course, I said. I understand completely. I did not take notes in front of him. I went to the bathroom afterward and wrote down the exact words in my phone. I left the meeting and called Sanne Broder from the street outside the building. I told her I needed her help. I told her I had documentation. I told her what I had found. Sanne was quiet for a moment. Then she said, how organized are you? I said, I have a box labeled tax documents. She said, come to my office tomorrow morning. Sanne spent 3 hours going through my materials. She was methodical and she was angry in the quiet, professional way that is much more effective than loud anger. She confirmed what I already knew. What Conrad had done was not accidental. The delays were strategic. He had needed time to develop his own manuscript using the conceptual framework he had taken from mine, time to get his book into production, time to establish his publication date before mine. If his book came out first, mine would look derivative, the student imitating the master. That was the plan. Sanne said, we can take this to the publisher's board, but we need to think about timing. I asked about the book fair. The Frankfurt Book Fair was 4 months away. Conrad had, I now knew, a reading scheduled. His book was being positioned as one of Brenwald's literary highlights of the season. Sanne looked at me. I looked at her. 4 months, she said, is enough time. We spent those 4 months very carefully. Sanne contacted a media lawyer who specialized in intellectual property in the publishing industry. We prepared a formal documentation package, the dated manuscript files, the modification history, the forwarded email to Tobias Frank, the cross-referenced passages, the timeline of delays mapped against the timeline of Conrad's book development. We also, through channels I will not specify in detail, obtained a copy of the production schedule for Conrad's novel, which confirmed that the manuscript had been submitted to design and typesetting in January, the same month as his literary magazine interview, and approximately 6 weeks after he had forwarded my chapter to his consultant. We also did something else. Sana reached out quietly to 2 other editors at other publishing houses. She had been in this industry for 20 years. She had relationships. She told them in general terms that a significant debut manuscript was going to become available, that there was a complicated situation with the current publisher, and that the book was extraordinary. Both editors asked to read it. I revised the manuscript one more time, not because it needed fixing, because I wanted it to be exactly what I had always intended it to be, without the shadow of someone else's interference. I spent 6 weeks on it. I was calmer than I had ever been. There's a particular kind of clarity that comes when you know exactly what is happening and exactly what you are going to do about it. In September, 10 days before the Frankfurt Book Fair, Sana sent the documentation package to the CEO of Brennwald Verlag, to the head of the legal department, and to a journalist at a major German literary magazine who had been covering the publishing industry for 15 years. The journalist received an embargoed version with a specific request: hold until the day of the book fair reading. The CEO of Brennwald Verlag called Sana within 4 hours. Sana's account of that call was that he was very quiet for most of it, which she said was not a good sign for Conrad. I did not attend any of the preliminary meetings. I was not in the room when Brennwald's legal team reviewed the materials. I was not present when Conrad was called in to respond. I was at home at my desk finishing the last small revisions to my manuscript, drinking tea from a blue ceramic mug that I had bought myself the day I finished the first draft 4 years ago. I drink from it when I need to remember why I started. The Frankfurt Book Fair. The main literary hall, Saturday afternoon. The session titled New Voices in German Literature. Conrad Veidt was scheduled to read from Was vom Feuer bleibt at 3 p.m. He was the second reader of the session. The hall held approximately 300 people, and it was full because Conrad was known, because his novel had been receiving advance praise, because people in this industry respected him. I was in the 3rd row. Sana was beside me. I was wearing a gray coat that I had bought specifically for this day, not because I needed armor, but because I wanted to feel like myself. I had the manila folder on my lap, not because I needed it, because I wanted to hold it. The first reader finished. There was applause. The moderator introduced Conrad. He walked to the podium with the ease of a man who has stood at podiums for 30 years. Silver hair, linen jacket, the calibrated smile. He thanked the moderator. He said a few words about the novel, about memory, about identity, about the way we are stored in the people who love us. He said these things in the voice of a man who believed he had gotten away with something. He opened the book. He began to read. I will not reproduce the passage here, but I will tell you that it contained an image of a woman finding her dead mother's handwriting on a grocery list, and the way that ordinary fragment becomes the only true record of who she was. I will tell you that I wrote that image 4 years ago in a small apartment in Hamburg at 2 in the morning, that it came from something real, that it was mine in the deepest possible sense. He read it in his voice. The audience was very still. It was genuinely moving. He was a good reader. I will give him that. When he finished the passage, there was a pause and then applause. He looked up from the book. He looked out at the audience, and his eyes found me. I do not know if it was the gray coat or the folder or just the particular stillness of someone who is not applauding, but he found me, and something in his face changed. Not collapse, not yet, just a flicker. A recalculation. I held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then I looked down at the folder. The moderator opened the floor for questions. The 3rd question came from a woman near the back who identified herself as a journalist from a literary magazine. She asked Conrad about his process. She asked specifically when he had first conceived the central metaphor of the novel, the woman reconstructing herself through others' accounts. She asked whether that concept had developed independently or whether he had drawn on other materials during the development of the book. The room was not yet aware of what was happening. It sounded like a normal question. Conrad answered it smoothly. He said the idea had been with him for years. He said all writers absorb influences. He said the specific image of the grocery list had come to him during a personal experience he preferred to keep private. The journalist said, I ask because I have here a dated manuscript file from a debut author named Clara Wendt, submitted to Brennwald Verlag 2 years ago, which contains that image in substantially similar form. The file metadata shows a creation date of March 2020. I also have an email from your editorial account forwarding a chapter of that manuscript to a consultant in November of last year, with the subject line, reference material. Can you speak to that? The room changed. It does not happen all at once. It is more like a tide going out, a gradual exposure of the ground beneath. People turned to look at each other. The moderator leaned forward. Conrad stood at the podium, and he was very still. He said, that is a mischaracterization. The journalist said, Brennwald Verlag's legal department has been reviewing documentation since last week. I have a statement from the CEO. Would you like me to read it? I did not stand up. I did not make a speech. I did not need to. The folder on my lap had already done its work 2 weeks earlier in a lawyer's office and a CEO's inbox. The reading was not the moment of destruction. It was the moment of confirmation. The moment when everyone in that room understood that the thing had already happened, that the ground had already shifted, that the man at the podium was standing on something that was no longer solid. Conrad said, "This is not the appropriate venue." The moderator agreed and tried to move on. But the room did not move on. Rooms like that never do. 300 people in the German literary industry, and every single one of them had just watched Conrad Veidt fail to deny something he should have been able to deny immediately. He left the podium. He walked through the hall. I watched him go. He did not look at me again. Sana put her hand briefly on my arm. That was all. What happened afterward was not a single dramatic event. It was a series of quiet, irreversible things. Brenwald Verlag announced the following week that Conrad Veidt's contract had been terminated by mutual agreement. The phrase mutual agreement was doing a great deal of work in that sentence, but the result was the same. His novel was pulled from the publication schedule. The literary magazine published the full investigation, including the documentation, the dated files, the forwarded email, and the statement from Brenwald's CEO, which acknowledged that editorial misconduct had occurred and that the publisher was taking corrective action. Conrad gave one interview in the weeks that followed. He said the situation had been misrepresented. He said influence and inspiration were part of literary culture. He said he had mentored many young writers and found it painful to be accused of exploitation. He said the word exploitation himself, which I thought was interesting. No one had used that word yet. He put it in the room. The interview did not help him. It made things worse because it confirmed for everyone who had been watching that he understood exactly what he was being accused of, and that his defense was not denial, but reframing. The difference between those two things is not subtle. He did not publish another book, not that year. As of the time I am telling you this story, he has not published another book. I want to tell you about the 2 months after the book fair, because I think this is the part that gets left out of these stories. I was not triumphant. I was tired. The kind of tired that comes after you have been holding something very carefully for a very long time, and you finally put it down. I slept a lot. I took long walks. I went back to Hamburg, and I sat in my apartment, and I looked at my manuscript, the full revised version, and I felt something that took me a while to identify. It was not relief. It was not satisfaction. It was something closer to grief. Grief for the 2 years I had spent navigating something I should never have had to navigate. Grief for the version of this experience I had imagined, the one where a good editor and a young writer worked together on something they both believed in. But grief is not the end of a story. It is a room you pass through. In November, Sana sent my manuscript to the 2 editors she had contacted quietly 4 months earlier. Both responded within a week. One of them, a woman named Dorothea Kessler, at a mid-sized independent publisher called Westlicht Verlag, sent a letter that I have kept. She said, "This manuscript is extraordinary. The voice is unlike anything I have read in years. I would be honored to work with you on bringing it into the world." I read that sentence and I thought someone said something like that to me once before, and then I thought, this time, I believe it. I signed with Westlicht in December. The contract was straightforward, the timeline was specific, and Dorothea's editorial notes were the kind that made the book better without making it less mine. She had opinions, and she expressed them clearly, and she also knew when to stop. That last part is rarer than it sounds. Die Stille zwischen den Worten was published the following September. The cover was designed by an artist I was consulted about. The launch event was at a small bookshop in Frankfurt, which felt right, not the book fair. A bookshop, the kind of place where people come because they actually want to read. I read the passage about the grocery list. My passage. In my voice. The audience was not 300 people. It was maybe 60. But they were quiet in the way that matters, the way that means something is landing. Afterward, a young woman came up to me. She was maybe 22, 23. She had her own manuscript under her arm, the physical kind, printed and bound, which told me she had been working on it for a long time. She asked me if I had any advice for debut writers navigating the publishing world. I thought about Conrad Veidt, I thought about the frosted glass light and the calibrated smile and the note in the margin of page 14. I thought about the box labeled tax documents. I thought about the blue ceramic mug. I said, document everything. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong. Find people who want the book to be yours, not theirs. And don't let anyone tell you that waiting is the same as learning. She wrote that down. I liked that she wrote it down. I drove home that night with the window open a little, the autumn air coming in cold and clean. I had the blue ceramic mug in my bag because I had brought it to the event for reasons I could not entirely explain and could not entirely dismiss. I took it out when I got home and set it on the desk next to my laptop, next to the notebook where I keep records of things that matter. I opened a new document. I started writing. That is what I want to tell you about the end of this story. Not the book fair, not the pulled contract, not the interview where Conrad Veidt put the word exploitation in the room himself. Those things happened and they mattered, and I am not going to pretend they did not feel, in some specific and limited way, like justice. But the ending is the new document, the blank page that belongs entirely to me, the voice that no one else gets to use. He took 2 years from me. He did not take the work. He did not take the voice. He did not take the story. Those were never his to take. One last thing, because I think it matters, and because I have not said it directly yet. If you are a young writer, or a young anything, and someone in a position of authority over your work tells you that you need to learn patience, that your moment will come, that the timing is complicated, that the market is difficult, that young voices need to wait, listen to the specific shape of that sentence. Listen to who benefits from your waiting. Listen to what is happening to your work while you are learning to be patient. Patience is a virtue. Manufactured delay is a strategy. The difference between them is not always loud. Sometimes it is very quiet. Sometimes it is a note in the margin of page 14 that says, use this, different context. Write it down, keep the files, find your sonnebröder, and when the moment comes, let the documentation do the talking. You do not need to raise your voice. You just need to have been paying attention. I was paying attention. The book is out, the voice is mine, the story is told, and somewhere on a shelf above my desk, there's a box labeled tax documents with a folder inside that I will probably never need again. I have thought about throwing it away. I have not thrown it away. Some things you keep, not out of bitterness, out of memory, out of the knowledge that you were right about what you saw, that the thing you felt in that room with the frosted glass light was real, that your instincts were correct, that the note in the margin meant exactly what you thought it meant. You keep it the way you keep a scar, not to show people, just to know it happened, just to know you survived it. And then you open a new document and you begin